Dermot, in everything you do, but especially in the novels, but also in the poetry, there's a sort of an intensity. And the intensity can come from various sources. But it strikes me that sometimes the intensity comes from a really personal, deep source. And so I really, with this book, The Lonely Sea in the Sky, I felt very, very strongly that the dedication was important. Could you read the dedication to us?
I could indeed. Well, I could as soon as I find it. I definitely would. You know. In memory of my father, Roger Bolger, 1918-2011, of Green Street, Wexford town, who voyaged to Lisbon on the MV Edenvale, the sister ship of the MV Kerlogue, and remembering his neighbour who took him to sea, Michael Turney of Green Street, Wexford town, who lost his life on the MV Cymric in the Bay of Biscay, February 1944.
There's one way of looking at this book, which is that it was written in the aftermath of your father's death, an attempt on your part to imagine him at a crucial moment of his life, but also an attempt for you, in the sense of imagining the boy on the boat, trying to imagine his father who has been lost. So there are many. So in those few years after your father's death, as your imagination, was fired up by various things. One of them was the idea of loss, and the other was the idea of this great adventure which your father had gone during the Second World War. So in one way, I see this as a really personal novel for you.
It's a very personal novel, and it's also then a novel about the politics of neutrality as well, which were very sort of interesting. But to go to the personal element, I suppose my father was an ordinary sailor and moved to Finglas with my uncle Owen, whose son is here tonight, and other people from Wexford and from Monaghan. And he never saw himself. He sailed to Lisbon. He never saw himself doing anything heroic. But anyway, I wrote loads of novels, and I gave him presents to my father. And God knows what my father made of The Journey Home or The Woman's Daughter or these really strange books. But my father enjoyed a whiskey of an evening, and he enjoyed retiring to his cabin with a good book. And so in some ways I felt, having actually plagued him with all these complicated novels in his life, that after in his death I might write a book that he might actually have enjoyed reading. And a book about those men who went to sea. And there were 800 Irish sailors who went to sea, Irish merchant seamen who went to sea, of which 149 of them never came back. They were bombed with equal neutrality by the Germans and the British. And my father never spoke about the war and never spoke about being bombed. And he was bombed on 3 occasions on those incredibly dangerous voyages to Lisbon. So in some ways, it begins with something personal in telling his story, and then you begin to, as you begin to delve into it, like everything else, you suddenly feel interested, like Churchill is trying to starve Ireland into the war. So I always presumed that my father's ship just sailed from Dublin to Lisbon, but no, you had to get a Navy cert. Only Ireland and India had to get these Navy certs from the British authorities, and they had to go to Wales first and pick up a cargo of coal on behalf of the English government to bring that to Lisbon to actually sort of to sell for them. And then you picked up a cargo, which hopefully was the cargo you were meant to collect, because that cargo came from America. But if you were late arriving, you had to pick up a cargo of convenience. And these were the only way for Ireland to get national supplies during the war. And Churchill was making it difficult. On the way back, you had to stop at a British port to have your cargo inspected before you were allowed to sail to Ireland. And so this is what happens in. To skip ahead slightly, this book is about not my father's ship, the Edenvale, but the sister ship, a smaller ship, 142 feet ship called the Kerlogue, which was bombed several times itself and saved a lot of lives, saved English seamen when they towed the ship along, and saved 168. Well, they picked up 168 German sailors out of the sea. 4 of them died on the ship being brought back, and the German commander, when they picked up these men, asked the Irish captain to go to France and drop them in France, and he would give them any amount of money they actually wanted if they do this. And he said, no, we're a neutral ship, we're a neutral country. And then the British authorities want them to land in England, as was the Navy service replied, in which case they would have become prisoners of war. And instead, he actually turned off the radio and sailed for Cove on this ship so dangerously overloaded that literally it was in danger of sinking. And so a story that begins as a personal story about my father also becomes the whole way that you realise that, as you think about that De Valera was almost using these men as the front line of the battle of showing that Ireland was a neutral country behaving in a neutral way. So the personal and the political always become mixed up.
Now, tell me this. You know that scene where they have got through to Valencia to say we have injured men on board, can we come into Cove?
Yeah.
And on the other side, the British begin to hear this and say, hold on a minute, who do you have and where are you? Mm-hmm. And then they begin to play with, one of them sort of blows into things so that it looks as though there's static and we can't hear you, which is one thing. Now, that's done in great detail in the novel. And I'm following it as I am following any sort of sea adventure story. From, like it could be Treasure Island. Oh my God, are the British going to come? What's going to happen? Are the injured? How is Jack going to deal with this? How much of that, the usual question, is an awful question, how much of that did you make up? How much of it do you know to be a fact? I mean the detail.
I know for a fact that they've been famous with Nelson, that when he was given an order, he turned
it's in the novel.
The other way. So he actually...
Yeah.
So
that he had used his blind eye, to say, oh, well, I didn't see anything, because he was looking through the telescope through his blind eye. Yeah.
So they were asked to go to France, and they said no. And the Germans said, well, we're your prisoners, so that's fine. And the British did try and demand that they land in Cardiff or in Swansea or wherever, and they were giving out to when the next voyage they had stripes torn off them for not doing so. So all that's true. But then it's a hard thing to write about real people. So I actually sort of looked at the crew that were there, and then I tried to invent a crew who were of a similar age and from similar places, but I could never recreate what the real thoughts of this crew were. Right. But I tried to just capture that quiet. And also, there's my father was from Wexford town, and you're a Wexford man yourself, you understand this. But there's Maeve Bennon, was a wonderful writer who died in New York, and she has in The Springs of Affection, which is her book of short stories, the opening story. There's a man leaving Wexford town on a horse and cart, and his mother's on one side, his sister's on the other. And they keep saying to her, like, why? They said, keep saying to him, why are you doing this to us? Why are you marrying a foreigner? Why are you bringing a foreign person into our lives? Why couldn't you marry one of your own? And they're going to Islegate, which is how many miles out the road is Islegate?
It's about 10 miles, it's quite near. Yeah.
And they're terrified of Islegate. There's all this space, and there's orchards and things, everything else. So I just think Wexford, and my father talked of Wexford as a small place with everybody looking over his shoulder. My father worked for the Staffords. John Banville's father worked for the Staffords. Everybody worked for the Staffords. But to go from that then to the darkness of blacked out England, and then to go to Lisbon where everything was lit up and everything was available, and there were no censorship, and there was the German spies were there, and just I tried to imagine what it must have been like for my father as a young Wexford boy. Suddenly, going up, if you sail into Lisbon, is an extraordinary sight, even just to walk the docks of Lisbon. But for these young Wexford fellas to go to Lisbon, and actually just how wondrous the whole thing would have been. So it's a book about danger and wonder, because it was also, if your ship was sunk, if your ship was hit by a torpedo, the shipping company were like really, really anxious to establish the exact moment of impact, because that's when they stopped paying the wages.
Yeah, that's in the book.
Because basically, when you went down, when you jumped overboard, you were no longer on the payroll, and that was so you actually had all these things. So you actually had to exist on a bit of smuggling and everything else as well. And I loved my father talking of Michael Tierney, who I mentioned there, and he was he becomes a character in the book, Miles Tierney, and he brought my father. My father worked for the my grandfather was a printer for the Free Press in Wexford, which printed the first books by Austin Clarke in his Bridge Press, and had a newspaper. And then he actually, a neighbour persuaded him to lie and pretend he'd worked in the seminary in Wexford town, and he got a job on the ship. And he actually, and Michael Tierney was a character, and he was the first voyage they were on. He drank all his wages and came home in Glasgow, and came home and told the wife that he'd fallen on one of them on the ladders, and the Staffords hadn't paid his wages because his arm was in a sling, and he had the arm in the sling, and the wife made a great fuss of him as a poor man, that those bastards, the Staffords wouldn't pay and everything else. And he had a great time, and then he came in the next morning with the other arm in the sling because he forgot which arm was meant to be broken, and it was like all these sort of and yet in the book he's very nurturing. And then there's just that tragedy that literally a few months later he actually lost his life. And if you go along the quays in Wexford, the quays in Dublin, sorry, there's a list, there's a monument to all the Irish sailors who died in those tiny ships. And the most tragic event is mentioned in the book. It wasn't actually the Kellogg, was another ship that was so overloaded, because these ships were just meant, in the Civil War, bridges got blown up, everything else. So these were coastals. They were meant to just simply go from, like, from Drogheda to Cardiff or down to everything else. Yeah. And they were out in Biscay, and there's a German submarine captain. And he comes across this ship, and he can't figure out what it is because it's so low in the water. He can't actually see what it is, what nationality it is. And finally, after half an hour of searching, he just says, "Ah, the hell with it, I just have to sink it." And when he gives the order for torpedo, it just lifts slightly, and he sees the tricolour. But it's too late, and all those lives were lost. And so it was just this world that I wanted to explore that was never been explored. And I wanted to give the sailors a chance to talk. And they're doing a bar in Lisbon, and they're talking and drinking, slagging each other. And it's just they took on lives, and I got to like this crew.
Ah, yeah. The reader does too, I think. Yeah. I'm back with my original question, which is that Jack, I mean, your motive, where are you as you start the book, where Jack really misses his father. So the whole idea of him being on board is to hear story. First of all, it's to look after his mother. But there's another reason for him to be there, which is to find these older men, many of whom have had some association with his father, and some are very difficult. So he's all the time hearing things. He's all the time paying attention. And there are moments when his motive at one moment when he decides to dive in to the ocean, is that something about his father has occurred to him. Now, this is a difficult question. I will ask it one more time, but you can evade it if you want. Which is surely.
I wasn't evading. I was.
No, you were. I saw you doing it. This period after your father's death, that you're actually writing a novel. I think it's very difficult for a novelist to work like that in a period like that, without in some way another story, it's or undercurrent coming back in about a boy just thinking about his father, and sea being a good place to do that, and sort of missing him and trying to work out what it was. I just wonder if you were I just presume this is true, but I wonder to what extent you were working consciously as a way of trying to rediscover aspects of your father at that time.
I think you try to imagine your parents in ways you cannot understand them. And my father was the only. Everybody has a tattoo now, apart from us, unless you have one since I saw you last. But like my father had a tattoo. It was a sailor's thing, and they were walking out of a pub, himself and a guy called Stephen Codd in Glasgow, and they saw a 10-shilling note on the ground, and they put their foot in it, and they both got tattoos, and there was, the world of that 20-year-old boy.
Hold on, they found 10 shillings on the ground. They got the 10 shillings.
And they went to a tattoo parlour, and they both got tattoos of Mother McCree on their thing, and which was beautiful when they were 21. But then it was so faded by the end of his life. So you're trying to imagine who this boy is, and sailors dressed in very sharp suits. They walked a certain way, they drank a certain way. I think my father's life as a sailor initially would have been quite exciting, because you sailed up the quays in Dublin, and you drank. And my father only went up on that ship, and my father only met my mother, because 3 sailors on the Eden Vale were drinking in the Liffey bar, and one of them was very slow finishing his pint, and they missed the last bus back. The ship was being repaired after being bombed. They missed the last bus back to the Alexander Basin. and they're running after the bus, coursing the guy who was slow finishing the point. And there was a Wexford sea captain lying leaning against the wall of the quays, and he said, "Lads, I'm on the Glen Cree, and the Dublin crew have all walked off because it was bombed. Do you want to switch ships?" And they wound up on this other ship, and there was this whole little world that you're trying to imagine your parents inhabiting. So in some ways, it was a chance to try and imagine that. Just to explain, in the ship, in the book, the young boy Jack goes to sea because his father has been killed. I think the thing that inspired that was that I remember talking to Barry Barnes, who was the actor, who's Ben Barnes' brother, and they knew they had a relation on one of those ships that went down in Wexford, and the man's wife used to walk down and stand at the sea every night for the next 6 months, just waiting for that ship to come across the horizon. Yeah. And that sense of grief of losing a father so young. Now, my father was quite old when I lost my mother very young. My father was too old when he died, in fact. But he had dementia the last 2 years of his life, and he was. It's funny he had dementia, but in the nursing home, I would go in to see him. And he would say, "What's happening on this ship? I haven't got paid in weeks. And really? The captain hasn't gone. What's the skipper doing, for God's sake?" You know? And then I'd want to ask the nurse about how my dad was doing, as I smuggled him in another small Jameson, which was my daily ritual. And I'd say, "I'll go and ask the skipper what the story is, you know." And he'd go, back. Don't call him skipper, call him captain or sir.
Oh, that's in the book.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, the Germans call him skipper.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So the whole hierarchy and the whole world of and my father would never wore a uniform in his life and never, and just regarded themselves as, you know, the lads are, every lad on the ship is smuggling something, because you needed that to actually just make that extra few bob. And I mean, the whole of Ireland existed on smuggling. Patrick Kavanagh always claimed that if he had spent the war years in Monaghan hopping across the border with a sack of flour on his back, he would have made more money than he ever made as a poet. And so there's that whole world of trying not to make them too heroic, but trying to make them very, very human. I hope that their humanity would shine through in the book, you know.
There's a moment towards the end of the book where they do talk about their lives and wonder, did we miss the world in going to sea all the time, missing our families, missing our friends, and just missing the ordinary idea of land and I suppose country? And they wonder about it. And did you? I think
my father did do that. I think he wondered, had he wasted life because, you know, he was away for. He was always away when relations arrived, which was a very, very, very handy thing, you know. But he was.
But I mean, when you were growing up.
But I mean, when I was growing up, my father was a registered letter that came from England with that blue cross and crisp English banknotes, and because he would send the wages home. I actually have in my little book of poems, I have the telegram from my mother sent to him to say that I was born, and his telegram back from the Princess Dock in Liverpool. So he was. I basically, my mother, my sailors used to get me 3 weeks holidays. Then the B&I introduced thing where you were on for 3 weeks and you had a week off. And suddenly he would have 12 weeks off, and that would have been such, because my mother and father were so in love and spent almost all their life apart. Maybe this is what added to the romance of their life, because they never saw each other. Yeah. But suddenly he was going to be home for 12 weeks, a year. And 6 months later, my mother died of a brain hemorrhage. And so suddenly my father was there, and we didn't really know him. And he didn't really know us, because there was this sort of...
What age were you then?
I was 9. So there was this filter in between us called my mother, who was, and so you know.
And what happened then? I mean, was he still away?
No, he would be away for 3 weeks. Then it was 2 weeks off and 1 week on, and to be back and everything else.
And was it mainly between Ireland and England?
No, it was, in those days it was Ireland, the Dublin, Le Havre, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, you know, but the thing is, these were in the early days. You'd sail up into the middle of Liverpool and you'd go into the pub. But by the end of it, you were sailing to these super ports. So you were on a concrete wharf 10 miles from Rotterdam, or 10 miles from Amsterdam, or not Amsterdam, sorry, 10 miles from Le Havre, or 10 miles from Liverpool. So you never really left the ship. And I think he did feel that he lost his life. So in some ways, going back to those times, so these extraordinary things that happened to him that he never spoke about.
Yeah. And you have these extraordinary descriptions in the book of what it was like when the father came home. For example, he always had things, pretend he didn't have things, presents and little things, but also when he was going again. That when he would go again, he would tend not to say goodbye to the children, but that you would hear the parents. There's all that business of, I suppose, arrival and departure, and all the rituals and secrecies and surrounding them.
Yeah, I do remember my father coming home, and then he would come home he would land in Dublin, and he'd dock in Dublin, and just come home for 3 hours, and then get a bus back. And I remember I would walk with him as far as the end of Clune Road. And he'd go off then to get a ship in the village, his bus back in the village. But coming home was a big thing. As children, my mother would suddenly light a fire in the front room. We banished from the front room.
Oh yeah, the parlour.
The whole sense of that romance. And my father was on the ships that were shipwrecked as well. And he was on a ship called the Cameo, and it was got caught on a sandbank off Arklow. And it was almost, and they were 3 days there, and then finally they were winched off to a lifeboat or by boat. And what he had in his back pocket was that he'd had a little doll for my sister June, which it was the only thing that he could get off the ship. And he bought that, and that doll became called Cameo, and was my sister's possession for years and years. So there was, it was a strange life. My father took a rather dim view of me being a poet. Because he was of that generation, you know this, Colm. It was just they want their children to have secure jobs, nothing else.
A job.
But the only advice he'd ever give me was, whatever you do, don't go to sea. That was the one. That was his only proviso. And when I spent a year trying to write at the age of 18 with some mad notion I could become a writer at 18, but make a living as 18, he actually, he gave me money every week with some reluctance, but just to get me. But there's one thing: just don't go to sea.
It's there isn't it, in the journey home, that idea of male friendship, of just two guys being very close and having a really nice time with each other. In this book, it's much more intense, and I wonder if it comes from your father talking about all the characters on the boat, the different ways these men, in this very confined space, had to both get on with each other, had to maintain a sort of solitude, but had to also make sure that that they didn't fall out or become fierce enemies.
Yeah.
I wonder if all that was part of what he brought home with him.
But no, what was interesting was that he never talked about the ship. But then I remember, I ran in the Great Fine Arts Centre, I ran a writer's workshop, and we had Seamus Heaney come down and give a read, and there was this drunk sailor came along and didn't know what, just saw people going to a basement, wanted to know what was going on. I said it was poetry reading, and he said, I wouldn't be in that hall, because can I go in anyway? I said, you want to? And then he said, anyway, he'd been with my father he said, Roger Bolger, he actually saved my life. I was drinking so heavily on the ship, and he nursed me back to health, and he was just a gentleman. So these various times I would meet men who'd sailed with my father, and they described his life on the ship. So everything was second, but you're getting these glimpses of this stranger, of this life. He had a life at home, which involved, basically going to the pub 4 times a day as religious observation, and not to drink massive amounts, but you went in the morning, but then there was this whole world of the ship that he had this little travel-light bag, and I'd leave him on the corner of Clune Road, and he disappeared into a world that I knew nothing about, So in some ways the book was an attempt to try and understand that world before I was born, because it's set during the Second World War. But so it was a case of just trying to imagine him at that age.
Because it's described in such detail in the novel, isn't it? Each character, where each one does, where each one comes from, the sort of rivalries and the ways in which they support each other. And of course, isn't it true that when you're writing a novel, that sometimes the strongest things you have in the novel come from silence? Comes from something you don't know, that didn't get said, you didn't hear, but you often thought about or imagined. Mm-hmm. And particularly, I think, with our parents' lives, grandparents' lives, it sounds, I wonder what that was like, just lying in bed like a 5-year-old, and then thinking, I could write down some idea of it. But sometimes the less information you have, the more you can do. Yeah,
and then you're putting that blank thing you have into reading descriptions of Lisbon during the war, reading books about Lisbon, and everybody in Lisbon was a spy, and information was the most valuable currency. Everybody was either a refugee, because there was an amazing diplomat, in Portuguese diplomat, who actually gave out, people were fleeing the Nazis and coming down to France, and they were desperate to get a visa to Portugal. And one day this guy came down and just gave out thousands of visas to everybody in the queue, and was disgraced he's now remembered as national hero in Lisbon, in Portugal, but was disgraced at the time because all these refugees came into Lisbon, and then they were stuck there desperately. And there's a description in the book of them. Very often they would go to the post office in Lisbon, and they'd just be waiting, hoping that one of their relations in America might get a phone call through to them, or a parcel might arrive, or just this limbo. And then you had the very, very rich living out the war in the big hotels, and buying stuff at door price, or buying anything valuable off the refugees. And you have this city of intrigue, and then you have these very simple men from Wexford and from Arklow just drinking in it and actually trying to and just making sense of their world,
Could you read us a list of names at the end of the book, which is not the dedication, it's just a list of the real men who were actually on the boat, who are not named in the novel, but that, you just to say, this novel is fiction, but nonetheless, this boat did sail, and these men who are not named in the novel need to be named here.
Yeah, and it's nice that there's now a plaque on the quays in Wexford to commemorate this, because people like in Sweden make a great fuss of these sailors in Ireland. In Ireland, it was because the war is such an ambiguous subject. There was never a sense that there was, but these were the small ships. These were the real-life crew were Captain Thomas Donoghue from Dungarvan, County Waterford. Chief Officer Dennis Vance from County Dublin. The second officer was Patrick Whelan from Wexford. The Chief Engineer was Eric Giggs from London. The second engineer was Joseph Donoghue from County Wexford. The third engineer was Gary Roche from County Wexford. Then the boatswain was John Chum Roche. There was a lot of Roches one sea went from Wexford. The helmsman was Thomas Grinnell. The able seaman was Tom O'Neill. And the other able seaman was Jack Furlong. There are Furlongs in my family as well. They're very Wexford names. Very Wexford names.
And so just I was going to ask you then, so you have this list of names, you have this ship, you have this thing that was not spoken about at home, which is something not spoken about at home always helps if you're writing a novel. But then you actually do have the real thing. So I'm just wondering, how do you then start to, in other words, what's the archive for this?
You just read everything, and then I had this.
No, but I mean, in other words, when you say read everything, do you mean that there's an actual? Is there a diary? Is there a?
No. There's almost nothing. There's a few. There's a Frank Ford, who was a captain my father sailed with, wrote a history of those Irish ships called The Long Watch, which is still the only book. I rearranged for it to be published around 20 years ago, but it's out of print now. Funny, he wound up in a nursing home as well. But he was really happy. My father was really unhappy in the nursing home because he was just an able-bodied seaman. Whereas Frank Ford was really happy because he was still a captain in the nursing home. But apart from this, there was and then when you read all the other books about the Second World War, and there's like three pages based on the Irish ships, they all just come from The Long Watch. Do you know what I mean? So you're just finding bits of diaries, you're picking up bits and pieces, you're going through archives, and then I had a map of Lisbon.
Just say this list of names. Sorry to interrupt you, but this list of names that you've just read comes from?
I was able to find those. I was able to find a lot of their reports, of their handwriting, of describing, because a couple of months before the Kerlog made this rescue, the Kerlog was attacked by two RAF planes. I think they might have been Polish pilots. I don't know exactly. And the original captain was actually left crippled for life, and and the ship was almost wrecked. So and then you'd have these official reports and everything else. So I decided that my father deserved a medal. My father didn't think he deserved a medal, but I actually did a lot of research. So I found a load of stuff before he died about his wartime voyages. That I was able to apply for a medal. It was actually that CD from Wexford, Roche, whose father had been on the Kerlog.
Who's that?
He was a junior minister. It was Dick Roche. Dick Roche.
Dick
Roche. He was presenting the medals as actually happened.
We're the Wexford continues. We're watching every moment.
It was Dick Roche.
So
it made it a very personal ceremony because Dick Roche's father had been on the ship and he was given the medal. But my father got really angry when I actually told him that he'd been awarded the medal for valour.
Why?
He said, because I was smuggling. He said, there was nothing wrong with what we were doing. You know, my father, it was just a job of work.
Yeah.
You know, and so he was, and I remember talking about the Scapa Flow, if I have the name correct, is where like the Germans got in and they sank almost half the British fleet at Anchorage. And I was describing to my father one day. He said, "Yeah, I remember I was there." I said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, I was on one of those small Welsh vessels, and they were just bringing supplies out to the big ships. I remember we woke up and there was all these ships were in flames, you know." So there's these things he'd never ever talk about. You know, you'd only mention something in passing, and he said, "Oh yeah, I remember that," you know.
Just of all your friends and all the people you know of our generation, are you the only one whose father was directly involved like that in the Second World War, albeit from the, you know, as a sort of in a sort of neutral way? Is there anybody else you can think of, you know, whose father fought with the British or was in some way...
Well, Peter Cunningham, the novelist a fine novelist from County Kildare, who lives in County Kildare, his father had been on the D-Day landings. And was quite a difficult man in some ways. He lived in Wexford, in Waterford, and people knew him. And I think he was quite... I've just written this new novel about post-traumatic stress. I think he had a bit of that from that time, you know. Right. So, but I mean, there were... I mean, again, you didn't... If you were involved in the British side, you didn't make it too public. Although, well, that's in my little house in Ferguson Road in Drumcondra. My house was occupied by a man who'd been in the Easter Rising, and next door was a man who'd been in the British Navy, and they were the best of friends. Yeah. And the man who lived in my house, because his name was Richard Scavi, would go in next door and they'd play cards at night, and then he would say, if there was strangers in the house, he says, "Oh, it's a bit late for my bus, I better go now, I have a long journey," you know, and he'd just go in next door. But again, so in the reality, there are loads of people who'd been in the British Army, and loads of people who'd been in the IRA, and loads of people who'd been in all those things, and they all mingled. They buried the things. So there was the private and the public.
The other thing I want to ask you about, I mean, you're talking first about this sort of ghostly presence of these ships in your own life. Your father not talking about it, aware that he must have done what he must have done. Secondly, there's the archive we talked about, the idea that some of this information is available and you can see it written down. But the third thing, of course, is literature, isn't it? Where there's such a great tradition of sea books, from Joseph Conrad's novels to Patrick O'Brien, but other novels in between that just told you about someone's stowaway, and ballads. There's a moment where he gets her onto the ship, you know, and she's dressed, and the whole business of changing the clothes is from all those ballads about, you know, Billy Taylor was a seaman, he went, and, you know, all that idea of who gets on ships. But I just wonder how much that literature mattered to you, or when you started reading it, or was it important?
Well, I tried not to read 20 novels about being at sea, because you're trying to imitate. But you take the characters come from, like, there's a character in the book who's like a second officer who's quite ill, and he's from Dublin, and initially he's quite unpleasant to Jack, and then he becomes like a father presence to Jack, and like he has a chip in his shoulder because he works in Guinnesses. Yeah. And that's actually based on a book of interviews that New Ireland published years ago about social class in Ireland. And one was with Finbar Flood, who was the first managing director of Guinness's, who was a Catholic. And he describes his first day of work in Guinness's. He went in, and there was one of the directors was going to minutes pages, and was turning the page. Yeah. And every time he would finish the page, he'd nod, and he might turn the page. And this went on the entire day. And then at a certain point of the day, the man looked up and looked at Finbar Flood, who was maybe 15 or whatever, in bewilderment. And Finbar was wondering, what's going on? And then he realised that he's finished, and he doesn't know why Finbar Flood is still there. Like, there's no thank you, there's no everything. Just like
blank.
Why are you still here? And so this almost shapes the character of why the second officer in my book goes to sea. He just goes, I'm not going to be. I could have stayed in Guinness's. I could have had a career. My father, it would have been, you know, a career for life, and my son would have had a job. But I refuse to stand in a room and have somebody. So the characters can often come. All the characters can come from little tiny things. Some of you worked in a factory, something else, and then they become the genesis of each character is based partly on trying to fit the description that I have, the limited description I have of the actual real crew, and then trying to find somebody and someone I met somewhere in my life who actually has the characteristics of that person, you know.
And in some ways, you know, it isn't really a sea book in the sense that they do go to sea, but it isn't pages and pages describing the squalls or the flat sea or the night or the stars. There's very little about stars in the book.
There's very little rum, sodomy,
and so there's very little, you know, but it is a big city book. You know, in other words, once you get into Lisbon and you realize, oh God, it's Christmas. And what's going to Christmas, New Year, which is sort of an inspired idea. You're going to get all the ceremonies. You're going to get New Year's Eve, that wonderful description in the book of New Year, in your book of what happens at midnight, but also Christmas Day. You're going to get all that in. But the description of first of all, the political situation in Lisbon in these years, but also the city itself, just the hills, the whole way the harbour is. So how do you research Lisbon in 1944?
I found a map. And my son, who's 6'7", his bicycle got stolen from the shed, so his bicycle came to live in my front room beside my desk, and it's a very large bicycle, and over his bicycle was spread the map of Lisbon in 1941, and then there was a map of Lisbon now that I knew from walking the streets. And I suddenly said, that's amazing, like there's a Nazi propaganda shop just at that corner, just by Black Horse Bay. I can't remember the description now. So there was a particular square, and there was a horse that the man, it looked black, you know, and there was all these sort of extraordinary things on the map that were, because, you know, whereas the Irish had this censorship where there was nothing about England in the war, nothing about Germany in the war, and even there was a famous Irish Times about a friend who died in a boating accident. They had to like almost disguise the thing. Whereas in Lisbon, you can go and you could read the most vile Nazi propaganda, and you could read all the American papers and all the British papers. So everything was just there, you know. So you
as a neutral country, they didn't impose the same censorship we did.
Nothing, and they knew that there was value in information, and so everybody was on the make to some extent, you know. And so it was very interesting, and also it was a dictatorship, and so you had to be very careful what you said. And at one stage, the lads get a bit too vocal in the pub, and they have to say, like, calm it down, lads. Remember, there's a secret police here, you know.
There's an element of, in High Germany, you're playing about, you know, the whole business of Irish fans going off to Europe to go to the soccer matches once Ireland starts to win them in about, 1988?
They won from 1988 to around 1989, I think. Then
1990 wasn't too bad. But after that, but that whole idea of where Irish people will find, you know, the pub they find, where they go to mass, that whole sense of the crew in Lisbon is, I think it's tremendously exciting in the way you match them with the city. But you do the same in Wales. That whole idea of the bombed city.
That's right, and the city that's just destroyed, and Tiger Bay with every sort of nationality all living there, and so he's seeing all these sites of, so they have to go to Wales first, and again my father never talked about that, but like you know, what he must have seen in England in those bombed out cities and everything else.
He's a really nice guy, this Jack of yours. You know, he's really dedicated. He loves his mother, his girlfriend, but there are
I try to base him on anybody from Enniscorthy, you know.
There are various moments where he has a real temper. He can really flare up. Like he's not just this mild, sort of compliant fellow on the ship. Like there are times when he's fierce.
Well, he's also deep.
I'm not asking you if that's based on
no.
I'm really not asking you that. But I'm just saying that he's a complex figure.
He's grieving for his father as well. So he is out of his depth. I mean, this is my on the other side of my family, where the Flanagan side, and my mother's from family of, I think it was 11, and the youngest was called Pat, and there were workmen down the road. They were digging the road, and he went down to ask for a job when he was very young, and he was sent back because he had short trousers, and my grandmother cried and put long trousers on him, and suddenly he was no longer a boy, he was a man. I went down and he got a few days' work there. And so there was that whole thing of adolescence was something that was invented sometime in the 60s when they began having long playing records. And before that, you know, when you looked at people, if I had to tell somebody who's 25, it looks like somebody who's 55 because they dress the same way. So in some ways he is a child inside a man's he's not wearing a uniform inside a man's clothing, trying to actually be like the other men, but also not having the emotional depths to really understand these things. And so he's on a voyage of discovery, you know.
The book itself is a sort of rite of passage for him, isn't it? Where he sees things that are unimaginable. As he says himself at one point, a month before, that he could imagine none of this, and here it all was having happened to him. And one of the great things about the book, one of the things I really love about the book is how tender it becomes. You know, you think, oh, he's on a ship, he's going to all these cities. You know, something is going to disturb his real innocence. And yet the men on the boat are incredibly nice to him, protective of him, each in a different sort of way. But even the captain, even the cook he's meant to be working for, each of them in some way or other makes sure he's okay. And some of this has to do with the legacy of his father, that there's something about what happened to his father or who his father was that makes this son an important element now, somehow in sort of rescuing something terrible that happened. And so the novel itself is working out something that these men need some way or other to get over what has been happening in their lives. And this boy on the ship becomes a way of sort of
these
symbolizing that.
And missing their families as well. So he becomes a surrogate son to all of those on the ship, including those who will never have sons. So there's a very old man who really shouldn't be on board, but he has no other life. You know, and I remember like one of the sailors who sailed with my father coming back, and there was a picture of the three of them in Lisbon, and he came back to Ireland after 50 years, but like he just didn't fit in. He lived in Australia, and so if you're at sea, you don't really have. You might have a flat or something, or you might have you might have a family. You might but often if you didn't marry. You were rootless, really. Your life was the sea, and so there's a Miles, I've actually, Foley, I've forgotten this. I haven't read the book for a while. You know, there's a very old man who is actually just simply, the captain just keeps him on because he knows he's half blind, but even though he's blind, he knows the way around the ship.
He can.
And he knows, and he's incredible wisdom. He just sensed everything. And again, but you just know that he's even though he shouldn't be at sea, he doesn't belong anywhere else. And that was the thing with those. I mean, I've another novel, you know, set in Grangegarman, and in Grangegarman,
in Grangegarman Mental Hospital.
Mental Hospital, yeah. And in Grangegarman, at the end of the 19th century, in the early 20th century, very often you only allowed out for one afternoon, and so you lost touch with your family. So very often, a certain point would come in old age where you just couldn't walk anymore, and there was a ritual where you actually stepped outside the door, and you waited a minute, and then you knocked the door, and you were readmitted as a patient, because there was nowhere else for you to go. So suddenly you went from being one to another, and so you know, so a lot of these men, their lives were at sea. And there was my father would have suffered grief as when his wife died very suddenly, and he described another man who lost his wife and walking up the gangplank in Dublin, and he slipped. But sailors don't slip on gangplanks. I mean, he just went down between the ship and the thing, and he wasn't coming out. Do you mean? And so, I mean, the only grief therapy there was given by a man called John Jemison, and that was it. And also the silent support of those sort of men. I remember, this is a very different thing. We're talking to John Sheehan of the Dubliners, and him. I'm talking about when they'd be going out and doing a gig somewhere, you know, they would all be drinking, but at the same time, like Barney McKenna would be saying to him, you better just keep an eye on Ronnie Drew, he's getting a bit drunk, and Ronnie Drew would be saying to him, well, you better keep an eye on Luke Kelly, he's getting a bit drunk. And so they were quietly keeping, and even though they seemed wild, there was that quiet little thing of them also keeping an eye on each other as well. And I think that happened on ships as well, you know.
Yeah. Dermot, thanks very much for this sort of illuminating account of the novel, which I have to say I found very intense reading.
I think we should run away to see it together.
And thank you very much, Dermot. It was really illuminating.
It's been a pleasure.